But the thing is that because this second step is deliberative and it requires effort, it means we don't always engage in that second step because we don't like to think very much, right? We don't like cognitive effort. And if you don't choose to engage in that second step, then that automatically activated stereotype is still going to be active. And so what differentiates, in other words, between, let's say, prejudice versus less prejudiced people, what differentiates them is that less prejudiced people are better able to override that automatically activated stereotype, either because they're choosing to override it or they simply have the ability to override it for whatever reason. Okay, so what that means is that if we want to decrease the extent to which people stereotype, there's a couple of different ways that we can do so. The main way is that we want to encourage people to take the second step to stereotyping, right? We want to encourage them to engage in this deliberative step to override that automatically activated stereotype. And there's a couple of ways that we can do that. First off, it's been shown that the more personal information you have about someone, the more likely you are to reject the stereotype that you might have about that person. For instance, it's easy if you've never been in contact with a gay person, for instance, to have certain stereotypes about gay people. But once you actually encounter and interact with gay people, for instance, and you learn that they don't all just fit into this stereotype, it becomes much easier to reject that stereotype because you've got personal experience with it. This is partly why I think one of the biggest predictors of people's attitudes towards gay people is whether they know a gay person. Because if you know someone, then you can see how they don't just fit into this neat stereotype that you might have constructed. And so the more personal information we have about someone, the easier it is to reject that stereotype. Another way to think of this, incidentally, is that you can think of stereotypes as heuristics. So remember we saw earlier that we rely on heuristics because they allow us to make quick judgments. And we use sort of rules of thumb to make quick judgments instead of having to think about something in depth, right? So we rely on like the availability heuristic, the representativeness heuristic, et cetera. We can think of stereotypes the same way. Getting to know who someone is a complex process that takes time and effort. But if we can simply apply a stereotype to them, that's a really quick way that we have of forming an impression about them. And so when we collect personal information about someone, what that means is we have more information. We don't need to rely on our heuristic in the first place, i.e. we don't have to rely on our stereotype. So that's one way to reduce stereotyping, is by encouraging interactions between people who might have stereotypes about each other. A second way to increase deliberative processing, which in turn decreases stereotyping, is by making sure people have the cognitive ability to engage in that second step. Because it's effortful, that's why we may not engage in that second step. What that means is the greater our ability is to think about that stereotype, the greater our ability is to think, the more able we are to reject that stereotype during the second step. And there are many factors that make us less able to think in depth about a stereotype. So for instance, research studies have shown that stereotyping is more likely to occur when people are under time pressure. So if you have to form a quick impression about someone, and you only have 30 seconds to do so, you've got to form an immediate impression about them, we tend to apply our stereotypes to that person. We tend to judge them in line with our stereotypes. But if you've got a lot of time to think about that person, to get to know them or whatever, we're much less likely to stereotype because now we have time to get to know who they actually are and therefore override that stereotype. We also know that people are more likely to stereotype others when they're tired, because when you're tired, you don't really have all the cognitive ability to think in depth about someone. And so people who are early birds, who function better in the morning than at night, they stereotype more at night than at the morning because they're tired at night. And then if you look at night owls, people who function better at night than in the morning, they stereotype more in the morning than at night because they don't have the cognitive ability to think in the morning. People are more likely to stereotype when they're drunk because one of the things that alcohol does is it narrows your focus. You can't focus on so many things at once. As a consequence, it becomes really easy to simplify the world by applying stereotypes to people when we've been drinking. When we're distracted, if you're doing some other task when you're interacting with someone, we have less cognitive ability to think about that person because we're doing something else. and therefore more likely to apply a stereotype to that person as well. So this becomes important for things like hiring decisions, because if you want to hire the best applicant for the job, you should not be applying your stereotypes, your race-based stereotypes, your gender-based stereotypes to the applicants. But if what you're doing is you have so many applications to go through and you're only spending 30 seconds on each one, well, now you're under time pressure, and now you're likely to apply your stereotypes. So one of the recommendations that researchers make, one of the applied recommendations for things like hiring decisions, is to make sure you're giving people enough time when you're going over their CVs or their resumes. That way you're less likely to apply your stereotypes. Okay, so getting personal information about someone reduces stereotyping. Making sure you have the cognitive ability to think about someone reduces stereotyping. And a third factor that's important in reducing stereotyping is having the appropriate motivation. Because we might have all the cognitive ability in the world. We're not distracted or drunk or tired or anything. We're able to think about someone, but we may not want to think about that person. We may not want to engage in that cognitive effort. And so increasing people's motivation to come to an accurate assessment of someone decreases the likelihood of stereotyping. Our researchers have shown that, for example, when people are given a motivation to form an accurate impression about someone, so they're told, for instance, that let's say they've got to choose a partner out of 5 people. They've got to choose a partner that they're going to work with on the subsequent task, and they're going to get paid money if they succeed at that task. Well, that gives people a motivation to pick the absolute best person to work with. And under those conditions, when people are so motivated, we don't apply our stereotypes, because our stereotypes are very crude heuristics, right? They're not necessarily going to be accurate all the time. And so we don't want to pick someone who's not going to be our best partner. And so we're more likely to differentiate people. We're more willing to spend the cognitive effort necessary to get to know people so that we can pick the best person. Oops. Okay, so one way, or one of the best ways we have of reducing stereotyping, is to increase deliberative processing, increase our ability to think about someone so that we don't rely on our stereotypes. There is another way to decrease stereotyping, although it's a much longer term project. And that is by focusing on the first step. So if I go back to that 2-step process, right? So far we've been talking about reducing stereotyping by getting people to engage in this second deliberative process, right? Well, one other strategy in a longer term sense is to focus on this first step by trying to reduce the extent to which group members make this automatic activation of stereotypes. So for instance, the fact that in our past, white men have been overrepresented as heroes in movies and TV shows, right? That tends to lead us to form automatic associations between white men and heroes, right? But what happens is that if you can increase diversity within TV shows and movies and things like that, one of the benefits of increasing diversity is that it starts to break down these automatic processes. Right? If you've been exposed to a more balanced array of people, that white men, that black men, that white woman, black woman, Asian men, Asian women, et cetera, et cetera. If all these people are represented as protagonists and heroes, for instance, then what that means is that when you come across someone, it's not going to automatically trigger a certain stereotype, because now you've seen a whole diverse array of people in that sort of hero role, right? So another strategy for reducing stereotyping in the long term is to attack this first step. Now, this takes decades and decades typically, right? But by increasing diversity in movies and TV shows, for instance, is one way to try to, over time, reduce that automatically activated stereotype of people.